Jip, Chapter 8, To School. Harvest well past, Mrs. Wilkins took it in her head that Lucy should go to school. The closest common school was beyond Avery's, so past Deacon Avery's granite quarry. The closest common school was beyond Avery's, near to a 3-mile walk, and Lucy had no interest either in that much exertion or in once again enduring the scorn of her peers. When she'd attended school in the village, she'd been known as the drunkard's daughter. She didn't figure that being a child of the poor farm would raise her status at the district school. But if Jip were to go as well... So Mrs. Wilkins began to work on the manager to send Jip, too. For his own part, Jip had no leisure to waste in the pursuit of education. He didn't have any free time to go to school. He'd tried before, but it hadn't been worth the chase. The building was ramshackle, the pupils unruly, students are pupils, unruly, and the teacher inept, was not able to keep control or to teach. He had quickly concluded, much to Mr. Lyman's relief, that learning was not for the likes of him. But last summer, between shearing and haying, the farmers in the district had built a new schoolhouse, 22 by 28 feet, put in new outhouses, cleaned out the spring and covered it with a small spring house, and wonder of wonders, hired a female teacher with a college education. When Mrs. Wilkins got wind of that, she was determined for Lucy to come under the influence of the only college-educated woman in the county. And if Lucy wasn't willing to go on her own, then there was nothing for it but that Jip should go too. Besides, it would be dusk before school let out. She'd feel safer if Lucy didn't have such a long walk alone. "We tried him at schooling," Mr. Lyman said. "He didn't take to it. Maybe he hit his head when he fell off the gypsy wagon. Leastways, he don't have the mind for letters now." "Oh, he's bright enough," Mrs. Wilkins countered. "He practically runs this place." Her eyes narrowed. "That's the problem, ain't it? Send him to school, the farm collapses." "I run this farm, if you please, Mrs. Wilkins. It don't depend on no snivelling boy." "Then he can go to school with my Lucy, like the law says." She was not a great lover of the law, but she didn't mind invoking it when it suited her purpose. "If the boy ain't mentally fit..." "Oh, the boy's fit enough. Might be the school weren't fit. I hear tell the big bracket boys run off that no-count schoolmaster they hired last year. Some teacher what lets himself be run off by his own pupils." "There's no textbooks to send with him, with either of them." "So be it," she said. "We can't conjure books out of the air. The new teacher will have to figure something." On the second Monday of November, a day so warm that the light snow of the previous day had melted by noon, Jip and Lucy set off for the new schoolhouse. Mrs. Wilkins had been mighty pleased. She had made Lucy a new dress, cut down from one of her own Sunday outfits. "There," she'd said, smoothing down Lucy's wide white collar. "You look fine. Won't nobody mock my girl at the new school." Holding tight to the lunch pail he'd inherited from Sheldon, his feet lost inside Sheldon's work boots, Jip waited for Lucy's mother to finish her fussing. She was patting and smoothing Lucy's clothes like a mother cat licking up her scrawny kitten. A pang went through him. Mrs. Wilkins had a sharp tongue and a ready slap, but under it all, she cared for her children. Somewhere, sometime, he'd had a mother. It stood to reason. Every creature has a dam, a ewe, a cow to lick it to life and nose it fondly. But somehow he had trouble imagining himself with one. It was like he was born the day he fell off the back of that wagon. Even the stranger had failed to mention a mother, only a mysterious maybe of a father, and an infinitesimal chance even of that. He shrugged away the useless thought. "If we're going to go, Lucy, we best we be going." Lucy pulled loose from her mother and trailed after him across the rolling fields. "Hey," she said when his long strides took him too far ahead. "Wait for me." He turned at the top of the hill to let her catch up, wriggling his toes. Mrs. Wilkins would not hear of his going to school barefoot. "My ma says it will be different at the new school, but I don't believe her." It's Lucy. "What do you mean, different?" "They mocked me in the village school on account of my pa. She said wouldn't nobody mock me at the new school. But they will. They'll mock me on account of my being from the town farm. He didn't know how to comfort her. She was probably right. The others would mock them. He could remember learning that much in school. They walked along in silence, crossing the pastures and fields going south. Ahead loomed the expansive scar in the earth that Avery called his stone quarry. It was surrounded by hills of rubble, the waste rock from the hacking and blasting of the stately granite. All this for a stone step or lintel or foundation block. As a little boy gazing from the pasture, that distant trough of bare rock had seemed beautiful to Gyp. He hadn't thought of it as a scar in the green hills. Close as he was now, he could see the gouges of the cutting tools and the blackened rock where the dynamite had blasted out the heart of the stone. It was that terrible black powder that had taken Sheldon from him. He shuddered. "Let's drop down to the road now, Lucy." "Does it scare you, knowing Sheldon died up here?" He didn't answer. Perhaps it did. At any rate, they swung down to the road and gave the granite trough and its little mountains of waste a wide berth. There was no one working there this morning. Avery must have his men felling wood up on the mountain. The man always had a half-dozen enterprises going, and there was less blasting lately. The selectmen had warned Avery to take care after Sheldon's death. They didn't want the quarry leaving any widows and orphans to the care of the town. A blessing Sheldon had been an idiot, leaving no dependents, they said. The schoolhouse was a warm red ochre in the sunshine. That's the color of it. Smoke poured from the chimney at the far end. The yard was empty, the white door was closed. "We're late," Lucy said. Gyp licked his lips and pushed at the door. Lucy was following so close he could feel her warm breath on his neck. Suddenly the door gave way, tumbling them into the room. In the dimmer light inside, it took a minute for Gyp's eyes to adjust to the scene. All he knew was that everyone was staring at them. There was a murmur of whispered laughter. He straightened as tall as he could and fixed his eyes on the front. There was a huge pot-bellied stove in the center. To the right of the stove was a teacher's desk. The teacher was standing behind it. She was tall for a woman and more angular than rounded. So you know about angles. They kind of have a sharp point at their vertex. So she's more angular than rounded. Her hair was pulled back as though she meant a stern face, but her eyes were smiling at him. "I'd say come in, but you seem to have managed that on your own. However, you could help by closing the door." Gyp reddened, much to the delight of the three large Brackett brothers sitting just to his left on the last bench. He turned quickly to obey, his mind working fast. He felt a need to master the laws inside this small kingdom. So, in other words, to understand them and follow them. There were fewer than 20 pupils, boys on the left, girls on the right. The distance from the teacher's desk seemed to be determined by the size of the student. Little ones sat on the front benches, biggest ones on the back. But all were under the watchful eye of a single ruler. For she was like a queen, no fancy dress or crown, but surely in command. Her voice was low-pitched, but you could hear each word clear across the space of the room. Gyp and Lucy still hesitated in the aisle. Where should they sit? There seemed to be no vacant places on the back 2 rows among the students closest to their own size, and the children on the front 2 rows were hardly larger than Toddy. "Just put your lunch pails in the cupboard over there beside the chimney, and then take a seat down here at the front for now," she said. "I'm still trying to sort out where everyone belongs." Teacher, for no one ever called her by any other name, soon determined that Lucy, who could read aloud a beginning primer with very little difficulty, would sit in the second row with children only a bit smaller than herself. To his immense relief, Teacher never asked Gyp to read. "Why don't you sit with the Bracketts?" she said quietly. "I think we need a moderating influence in that row." So she needs someone who will behave to balance out how badly they behave. She handed him a book and a slate from the shelf near the cupboard. The shelf must have had several dozen books on it, more books than Gyp had ever seen assembled in one spot. "And," she smiled down at him, "when the others go out at noon recess, would you wait and let me talk with you for a few minutes?" The Brackett brothers were nearly the size of men, but their punches and snorts betrayed a nature that would have made Sheldon seem adult in comparison. So they're big boys, but they act very juvenile, very immature. They were loath to move their gangly limbs. They didn't want to move over and make room for Jip. But teacher's stare brooked no disobedience, so the teacher just stared at them, and they didn't dare disobey. Jip sat down beside Willie Brackett, the youngest, holding his body stiff so that it wouldn't touch him by accident. The morning passed slowly. He stole a glance at Lucy. She had her head bent over the slate teacher had lent her, and seemed to be working on the sums the schoolmistress had set for the older students to add. With the help of his fingers and invisible toes, Jip struggled to do the very simple ones teacher had quietly written on his slate. Sometimes he just stared at the engravings in the primer teacher had handed him. He tried to puzzle out the words, but he couldn't get enough of them in a row to unravel a whole sentence. So a primer was a book that was used in class schools long ago, and it would just be a little book, and there would be like first primer, second primer, and when you started, you would start in the first primer, and you would learn through it, and there'd be things to read and things to learn, and then they would gradually get harder, of course, as you went up in the primers. Finally, teacher dismissed the pupils to fetch their lunch pails from the cupboard and take them out to the schoolyard. Jip got up and let the Bracketts tumble past him, then sat down again to wait. Already he knew that it was hopeless. Some of the tiny ones in the front row could not only recite their alphabet, they could make out words and whole sentences. Jip would never catch up. He would tell teacher when the room cleared. He didn't crave the derision of the Bracketts, so he didn't want to say it in front of them, and they would make fun of him. "Come up to the front," she said, "and do sit down." He sat on the stool near her desk that in the old school had been reserved for dunces and disobedient pupils. There was a globe on the desk and more books. "No one has ever told me what your proper name is." "Jip," he said. She waited for more. "Just Jip, on account of some say I fell off a gypsy wagon." "They never thought to give you a surname, a last name?" "I'm thinking on the town record it says West for the West Hill Road where Deacon Avery picked me up." "I see," she said, but he could tell she thought his was a poor excuse for a name. "Have you ever thought of giving yourself a name? A new name?" "No, Marm." "I have a friend who gave himself a new name, Ezekiel Freeman." "Never mind. It's not up to me to tell you what to do." He was beginning to like teacher a lot. It made him a little sad to think that this would be his last day at school. "Now to business. You haven't had much chance to come to school, have you?" Jip shook his head. He felt like a shamed pup. "Listen to me, Jip. You mustn't be embarrassed. It's not your fault." "They say I ain't got the head for it." "Who says?" she asked sharply. He looked up at her. Her dark eyes were flashing away. "Don't you let anyone say you don't have a head for learning." "But—" He needed to tell her that it was true. The sums and words just spun around when he tried to fix his mind on them. "You're working like a man. Just how old are you, anyhow?" "I don't know." He hung his head again. "How could you know? You would hardly land on the West Hill Road with a baptismal certificate sewn in your bib." So a baptismal certificate is something that your family gets if you are baptized in a church, and it would say your date of birth and your date of baptism and your name, of course. So she's saying, well, how could you know how old you were? You didn't land on the West Hill Road when you fell off the wagon with a baptismal certificate that would say all that information on it. Was she teasing him? He peeked to look, but there was no joking in her features. She was madder than Sheldon's hen, but not at him. "Is there anyone on that farm who could help you if I gave you work to do at home? Someone who could help you catch up?" "Put? Maybe Put." "Put?" "Putnam Nelson, our lunatic. The man they have in a cage up there? He's plenty bright, and he don't always rave. He's got lots of good spells. Him and me are regular friends, really." Some of her primly pulled back hair was loose from its knot, framing her face. It made her look more gentle-like. That and her smile. "How fortunate he is. How fortunate you both are to have such a friend." "Yes, Marm. And Lucy, too. She knows her letters right smart." "Yes, Lucy can help you." She looked at him closely. "You wouldn't mind, then, taking lessons from a girl, one younger than you?" Why should he mind? "I'd like to be able to read and to figure." "Good. Then you'll do fine. Just don't let anyone talk you out of coming to school now. Do you understand? They're sure to try, but it's your right by law for at least 3 months out of the year." The law says I got to go to school? Amazing that the law should bother itself about him. Yes, she says, sometimes even the law is wise. Now, she stood to let him know he was dismissed. Go out and eat your lunch and enjoy the fresh air. There won't be many more days like this. He grabbed Sheldon's pail from the cupboard and ran outside into the pale November sunshine. There was some disturbance on the far side of the schoolyard near the spring house. He would have ignored it in favor of the chunk of bread and slice of cheese he knew to be inside his pail, but he had no sooner sat down on a stump and pried off his tin cover than he heard Lucy's voice. It was coming from the center of the ruckus, shrill and angry and fearful. You leave me be, you dirty bullies! I ain't pestered you none. Leave me be! Jip put down his pail and ran across the yard just in time to see Willie Brackett grab Lucy's pail. Give it here, Brackett. Jip did his best to imitate Teacher's intimidating stare, the one that stilled the back row whenever it grew restless. Who'd want it, Willie said, trying to sound careless. Poor farm rubbish. He shoved the pail toward Lucy. With one motion, she took the handle and swung it around, bashing the edge into Willie's head. The boy let out a howl like a bobcat. Lucy walked away, the crowd stepping back to make room for her. Come on, Jip, she said. They walked over to the stump. Lucy sat down beside his pail, still dazed by the strength of Lucy's anger. Move over, she said. He obeyed. Meanwhile, Willie's shrieks had brought Teacher to the schoolhouse door. She looked around, quickly checking the yard until she spied Willie fingering the bump that was growing on his skull. Come on in, Willie, she said. Looks as though you might need a cold compress. Lucy watched warily, nervously, as Willie stomped past her to follow Teacher into the building. Will she cane me, you think? Lucy whispered. Why would she cane you? That would mean being hit by a cane. Ma said you was never to fight on the schoolyard. At my other school? I don't think this is going to be like other schools, but mind who you hit, he might swing back. She giggled. Teacher kept Willie on the stool near her desk, a wet rag on his head for most of the afternoon. Then a half hour or so before dismissal, she sent Willie with his rag to his proper place and told everyone to close their books and put away their slates. Now it's coming, Jip thought. He glanced down at Lucy. Her head was resting on her hands. He could tell she was scared. But instead of a licking, meaning a beating, or even a lecture, Teacher pulled a fat book off her desk and commenced to read. She began to read a book to them. She didn't even look about to see if anyone was listening, just sank into the words like someone falling down to rest on a feather bed. Among other public buildings in a certain town, she began, which for many reasons it will be prudent to refrain from mentioning, and to which I will assign no fictitious name, there is one anciently common to most towns, great or small, to wit, a workhouse. And in this workhouse was born, on a day and date which I need not trouble myself to repeat, inasmuch as it can be of no possible consequence to the reader, in this stage of the business at all events, the item of mortality whose name is prefixed to the head of this chapter, Oliver Twist. So she's starting to read them the book Oliver Twist, which is a very famous book written by a very famous author named Charles Dickens. But I want you to listen as she reads parts of the book and see if you can see things in common with Jip's life. So she's talking about a workhouse, a place where people would work, kind of like the town poor farm, and a child is born here, and his name is Oliver Twist. At first, Jip had trouble getting his head around the sentences, like chewing meat that's all gristle, but he let go and listened to the comforting music of Teacher's voice. It was clear how much at home she was with these words, how she loved them. As they climbed the hill past the quarry, Jip ventured to ask Lucy about the reading. It don't seem regular, Lucy said. I never heard of a teacher reading from a storybook before, a book what don't even teach us how to be good Christians. You wouldn't tell on her. She spun around as though Jip had accused her of treachery. Of course I wouldn't. You take me for a fool? That boy in the workhouse, that Oliver? It was just like a poor farm it was, only worse. Him being born there, his poor beautiful young mother dying. He didn't rightly know who he was neither. Now Lucy snapped out of her dreamy state. I wager he finds out, she said. How come? That's how stories is. Truly? I swear it, she said solemnly. They walked along in silence for a while. Chip kicked a stone for several yards, then gave it up. If he injured Sheldon's boots, he was like to get a licking. Maybe I could figure out. What? Figure out how to, where I come from, without no stranger meddling between. He paused. You think? Maybe, she said. We'll have to go every single day to find out how that Oliver does it. Every day, he agreed, squeezing the primer that teacher had loaned him.